But we begin here in Alberta, where Danielle Smith has clinched a majority United Conservative government. Just over 1 hour ago, I spoke to the Premier about her plans for the province and the fight she's waging with the federal government. Well, Premier Smith, congratulations and thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
A majority government, but a diminished caucus. You've lost quite a few cabinet ministers in the results. What message do you take from that outcome last night?
Well, I would say I was really encouraged to be able to get, I think we got 52.5% of the popular vote, and that to me is a very strong mandate. What I did see is that the left is consolidated now in our province. It really is a two-party province in a way that it hasn't been in the past, and I think that's going to mean that we have a very strong opposition that is going to do its job loyally, I suspect, and we're going to have to respond to that. So there are going to be a lot of issues that we're going to have to make sure that we're hearing all voices and that we're governing for all Albertans. That's what I took from it.
Well, how do you do that? I mean, you're locked out of Edmonton. You were reduced in Calgary. It's a bit of a rejection of the United Conservative Party by urban voters.
You know, I look at it a little bit differently. We've got a lot of mid-sized cities in Alberta, and so we've got a number of seats in Calgary. We've got representation in Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, Red Deer, Grand Prairie, Fort McMurray, the donut around Edmonton. So I feel like we actually have a very diverse caucus who are going to bring a diverse perspective, and I think that will allow us to do a great job of governing. We've had 7 months to be able to put an agenda in place, and we got a mandate to continue that, so I'm pretty excited.
The NDP made you the centerpiece of their campaign. They made this a referendum on your credibility. I mean, how do you think that showed up in the outcome last night?
Well, the fact that we got over 50% of the popular vote, I think that says that people took all of the aspects into consideration, and what they decided is they like the UCP agenda. They like the fact that we focused on the things that matter to them, which are jobs, the economy, affordability, the work that we've already begun on healthcare and addressing mental health and addiction, our focus on public safety and making our streets safe. I think people voted for that agenda, and I'm delighted to be able to move forward on it.
That agenda in the election was different than your agenda when you ran for the leadership. You know, you moved away from a lot of those things. How do you convince Albertans they're getting the Danielle Smith they saw during the campaign as opposed to the Danielle Smith they saw in the leadership or in many of the videos that surfaced during this campaign?
Well, I think people know that I will work collaboratively with Ottawa where I can, and I have. We signed a $24 billion healthcare deal. We've also moved forward on a $3.8 billion childcare deal so that we can have $10 a day daycare for families. And the Prime Minister was very helpful when we've had our worst firefighting season in our history in this spring. And he's been very helpful in making sure that the military resources were there for us and to make sure that our First Nations communities here are also supported. So those are things that I will work with the Prime Minister on. But they also know that there's a hard line when it comes to anything that will damage our economy, that we are not going to just transition our oil and natural gas workers out of jobs. We are not going to pursue a net zero power grid by 2035, which even the NDP in Saskatchewan says is unaffordable. We're seeing as well our Atlantic premiers also really frustrated with some of the aggressive agenda from Ottawa. So I think we've got some allies there. And people know that I'm going to stand up for them on those things.
Okay, I want to explore that more in a second, but I want to just sort of get back to the question of which Danielle Smith is Alberta getting now that you've won the election and become premier? Because the leadership agenda was different than the campaign agenda, and some of the things you said in the past in your previous life in the media is different than what you're doing now. I mean, how do you convince Albertans that the candidate they saw the last 4 weeks is the premier they're going to have for the next 4 years?
Well, people know that when I'm in this position that I'll run on things and I'll implement them. I said that we were going to move away from mandates, and we did. I said we were going to start reform of Alberta Health Services, and I did. I said that we were going to stand up to Ottawa, and we are. So I mean what I say. I don't always have to take a combative position, though, because there are other things that matter to Albertans. I mean, part of the reason you stand up for Ottawa is just not for the sake of picking a fight. It's for the sake of protecting Albertans. Albertans want to continue with the jobs and economy and growth that we've seen. Remember, we had a really hard time for about 8 years, and we are finally just getting our groove back with people moving into the province again. Our Alberta's Calling campaign is working. We're seeing job growth. We're seeing diversification like I've never seen before. Venture capital is coming here, and people want that to continue. And so I would say it's both.
But you know, you've also come through wildfires throughout this election campaign. A lot of people see that as linked to climate change, just fairly conclusively. The resistance to moving quickly on a net zero grid, to moving on an emissions cap. I mean, can Alberta and Ottawa work together on a climate change agenda in any kind of a meaningful way, the way things stand right now?
Just before the election, we released our own emissions reduction and energy development plan, and I think the answer to that is yes. I've told the Prime Minister, I told him this the very first time I talked to him, that we are working towards the same objective, which is carbon neutrality by 2050. And when you look at the ability for us to export LNG and get credit for it internationally, when you look at the work that our companies here are doing on net zero themselves, like we've got the oil sands companies, a hydrogen company, Air Products, as well as Dow Chemicals, all saying that they have a net zero by 2050 aspiration, the development of our hydrogen industry and infrastructure, the ability to bring geothermal onto our power grid. Those are the things that we can work on together. And that's what I've told the Prime Minister is, let's reset our relationship. Let's work on an aspirational target that we know is achievable, but don't put arbitrary targets in place that we know are essentially going to be production caps. And those are the two things that we're going to have to work on over the next little while.
Is this the conversation you had with the Prime Minister today? You had a phone call with the Prime Minister. What can you tell us about how that went?
I did tell him that I've been very frustrated with the posture that his Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, has taken towards our province, and that I want to be able to reset the relationship on things where I think we can work together. When you look at Alberta, when Alberta does well, the rest of the country does well. We generate an awful lot of federal tax revenues. And I think everybody should be rooting for us to continue doing well, because when our industry is doing well here, it means that there's more jobs in manufacturing in Ontario and Quebec to be able to help us out. This is the way Confederation is supposed to work. And I don't think it's appropriate for a federal government to try to stop that growth, especially since we're aligned on the general objective. And that's what I hope we can continue to work on.
You're in the Premier's office with a mandate of your own after winning the leadership. But, you know, historically, Alberta Premiers haven't had a lot of job security, right? They either get forced out or voted out after one term. I mean, how secure do you feel in this job with the smaller caucus and just with history in Alberta being the way it is politically?
Well, I look back on history, and when Peter Lougheed had his great breakthrough in 1971, he had 44% of the vote. When Ralph Klein had his great breakthrough in 93, he had 44.5% of the vote. We just got a 53% mandate. And so that says to me that the Conservative movement is unified, which is what I always wanted when I got back into politics. I was worried that we were seeing division in our Conservative family, and I wanted to be able to bring everybody together. Now, we've got a bit more work to do, of course, because there's a very strong opposition, and we have to be mindful of the things that they bring forward, and I have to govern for all Albertans, and that's what I'm going to do. But I feel pretty good about the mandate that I got.
Do you think you have your caucus completely with you? I mean, there were these rumblings and stories throughout the campaign that people were saying that you could very well face a leadership challenge shortly after winning this if it was a small caucus or reduced majority. Where do you think that stands now?
Well, I'm going to meet one-on-one with all of my caucus members. I think we've got some incredible talent in our ranks, and my approach with all of my caucus members has been to find out why it is that they're running for office, what it is they want to accomplish, and then be able to help support and nurture them in that. To me, a lot of politics is just basic respect and personal relationships. I know that a lot of people give up a lot to be in public life. I know I have given up a lot, and I think that mutual respect goes a long way. So I'm looking forward to meeting with my caucus over the coming days.
Do you think you have members of your caucus you need to bring on board? Do you think you have discomfort there and concern after the way the campaign went and where the result was?
I've been so delighted at how unified my caucus is. I mean, you have to remember when I first came in, the biggest challenge I was told is that this was a caucus that couldn't be brought back together. There was too much infighting, too much internal division. We were 20 points behind in the polls, and we pulled it together. I mean, they had some confidence in me, I had confidence in them, and we pulled together as a team. So I know that there are some good people who won't be joining us, and you know, I think we'll all be sad by that, but we also have a really strong team that's going to be around that table, and I'm going to work really, really hard to make sure that we continue to demonstrate that to Albertans.
So you're not worried? You don't think any caucus challenges, any difficulties in holding it all together after this campaign?
I'm a pretty persuasive person. I think that we all benefit from staying unified and focusing on the agenda that Albertans elected us on, and that's what I'll be focused on doing.
Will some of the older issues come back onto that agenda? I know the Sovereignty Act was one of your signature moves very early, and it kind of got pushed to the side during the campaign. You've talked about enshrining rights for the unvaccinated in the Human Rights Act, health spending accounts for uninsured services. Are these things you bring back now that you've won the election, or are they off kind of to the side for good?
Well, I always said that the Sovereignty Act really was a way of educating the country, the Eastern media, as well as the federal politicians about how our country is supposed to work. Our country is, and our Constitution is written in a way that gives autonomy to the provinces to develop their resources, including electricity, in their own way, in what makes sense for local conditions. And so we've had that conversation. I think people now understand that I'm serious about defending our jurisdiction. I have lots of ways that I can do it. It's just one other tool in the toolbox. And I'm very hopeful that the Prime Minister won't come through with aggressive legislation against us, like an emissions cap that's unachievable and would be a production cap, and like the clean electricity regs, which would impose a net zero power grid by 2035. Those are the things we're going to have to fight, and I think we've got allies with Saskatchewan and the Atlantic premiers as well, and I think that they're seeing that they've got to be a lot more collaborative at the federal level.
How do we get to net zero, though, without an emissions cap as a country? Does there have to be an emissions cap of some kind, or is it just not the one that Justin Trudeau's proposal?
We don't need an emissions cap, because we're seeing it as you develop technology. Just even the transition from coal to natural gas has dramatically reduced emissions. As we develop out our hydrogen infrastructure and we see zero emissions vehicles powered by hydrogen, that's going to reduce emissions. As we bring more geothermal, as small modular nuclear becomes available, as we start developing carbon capture, utilization and storage to bury emissions underground, as we figure out direct air capture, there's a number of companies working on that. I'm very optimistic that with technology we'll solve the problem. But if you short circuit that and try to achieve an unachievable target too early, you end up chasing the investment away, and I think that would be counterproductive.
So you say you want to work together with the federal government. This is a final point. It sounds like this issue, and with the way Minister Guilbeault has portrayed it in the past, we could be headed towards a Danielle Smith, Justin Trudeau showdown over this potentially.
I hope it doesn't turn into that, but people know that I will not sacrifice the Alberta economy. I will not sacrifice Alberta jobs. And I'm not going to sacrifice our oil and gas industry. I'm proud of our industry, and anybody who thinks that it is going to be phased out or just transition, it's not going to happen. So I'm hopeful that the Prime Minister recognizes that, but those are the very tough conversations we're going to have over the coming weeks and months.
Premier Smith, thank you for your time.
You bet, my pleasure.